Whenever you're being questioned by the police, either in custody or not, you should always think about whether it's in your interest to answer the question, and if there is a slight chance that whatever you're going to say might incriminate yourself, then exercise your Fifth Amendment right to remain silent. Most people want to avoid hassle and want to cooperate with the police. That is fine, as long as you don't incriminate yourself. The best thing to do is, if ever a policeman asks you a question, the first words out of your mouth should be, "Officer, am I required to answer that question?" More likely than not, the officer is going to tell you that you have the right to remain silent. Then you can decide whether you want to exercise that right or not. Generally speaking, you should never answer questions voluntarily. You want to remain silent as much as possible. Anything you say may be used against you. Now let's say you're stopped in the street by a police, or you're pulled over by a police, and then he asks you a bunch of questions. Now throughout this interaction, you should always ask, and ask often, "Am I free to go?" Because more likely than not, you are free to go, and the mere fact that you're staying when you are free to go is an indication to the officer as well as to the law that you are staying voluntarily. Remember, the police is not obligated to explain to you your rights. The police is not going to tell you, I'm going to ask you a few questions, and by the way, you're free to go and not answer them at any point. Sometimes the officer might be ambiguous and say, I have a few more questions left, or I'm not quite finished yet. You should ask him again, "Officer, am I being detained, or can I go now?" Okay, most likely you're free to go, in which case you should leave immediately. If the officer tells you that you're being detained, that triggers your Fifth Amendment rights to remain silent and also to ask for counsel. In which case, you should say the following magic words: "I'd like to remain silent, and I'd like to speak with a lawyer." And after you say those words, the policeman must immediately stop asking you questions. He is legally obliged to do so. Never consent to a search. If an officer has to ask you for permission to search your car or your backpack or your home, then he probably needs a warrant to legally conduct that search, and he doesn't have one. Unless you want to help a policeman out to find evidence to later incriminate yourself, then you should not consent. First, you should always confirm whether the officer is indeed asking for your permission or consent. So if the officer asks, "Can I take a look at your backpack?" your answer should be, "Are you asking for my consent to search my backpack?" Officer goes, "Yes." And then you should say, "Officer, I do not consent to any searches." Let's say that the officer asks you, "Mind if I look in your trunk?" Are you asking for my permission to search my trunk? Yes, I am. Then you just say, "Sorry, officer, I do not consent to any searches." He needs a warrant to search your trunk. Unless you consent to that search, he does not have any legal authority to search your trunk. And if he does search your trunk, anything he finds in there that might be incriminating can later be excluded from evidence. You're driving on a public road and you are pulled over by a police officer. The first thing you should do is turn off your engine, but leave your lights on if it's dark outside, and then crack open your window, but do not exit the car and do not reach for your glove box. In fact, your hands should be on your steering wheel and visible to the officer at all times. When the officer walks up to your car, you should ask, "Hello, officer. will you please tell me why you stopped me? More likely than not, the officer is going to ask you, well, why do you think I stopped you? That's a trick question, because he probably doesn't even know why, or if he does, he's not sure. Because if he stops you for speeding, the instruments the police use have a margin of error, and quite frequently you are within that margin of error. Is it because I was driving faster than the speed limit? And then he's going to write that down and use that as admission against you. So don't shoot yourself in the foot, and don't guess what the police may or may not know, and just say I don't know, and that's perfectly fine. And then the police officer will ask you for your ID and registration. They have the legal authority to ask for that, and you should provide them. You always want to be polite and courteous and respectful to the officer, and address the officer as sir or ma'am or officer, because truly the officer's job is hard and he's there to protect you. So you want to cooperate as much as possible. You should never argue with the officer. You should never resist or obstruct. And obviously you should never flee. Now, if you know for a fact that the police officer is treading on your constitutional rights, right then and there is not a good time to address that violation. The time and place is after the unlawful search in a court of law. That's what courts are for. Well, that is all for today. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up down below. And if you haven't already, please consider subscribing. A lot more videos coming your way every week. So until next time, thank you very much for watching. Goodbye.